One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Can you imagine if you spent 20 years of your life trying to be a success, trying to really be someone, and you really have this bold ambition to reach the moon? But then, when you actually become that someone, you realize the person that you've become is not what you want to be at all. I grew up in a small country town in a place called Shepparton, which was about 200 kilometres north of Melbourne in the southeast of Australia. And I had 6 brothers and sisters, and there they are, most of them. And all of those brothers and sisters I had left school by the time they were 15. And they didn't leave school at 15 because they wanted to leave school. They left school because it was a necessity. Because when we were growing up, it was really tough to make ends meet. And although I grew up with a lot of hardship, as a kid, I also grew up with a big dream. And that dream was to become a professional cyclist. And I started racing BMX when I was 9 years old. And by the time I was 16, I'd progressed to the velodrome and then onto the road. And the year that this photo was taken, which was 1987, that's me on the left, I had qualified with my friend and training partner, Stuart Mackenzie, to race the Australian Championships. So I was one of the best riders, I guess, of my generation. I worked really hard to get there. You know, as a kid, cycling was my life. But I never forget, I guess, from the age of around 15, something started to happen. And I guess the first sign of that was my interview with my careers advisor at school when I was about 15. And I met with my career advisor and she said, "Jamie, what do you want to be?" And I said, "I want to be Greg LeMond." And of course she said, "Greg LeWho?" And I explained that my dream was to become a professional cyclist. And this conversation went on for a while, but I never forget the words that I left her, that she left me with. She said, "Jamie, maybe it's time to be realistic." You see, because the other thing I was, besides being a good cyclist, was actually I was a pretty smart kid. And I did very well at school. And in fact, not too much after I raced the Australian Championships, I sat my end of school exams. And I did very well. And in fact, I did so well that I was offered a grant to study at the University of Melbourne. And the University of Melbourne is one of Australia's best places of higher education. And I remember getting this letter from the university and lying in my bed on a Sunday night and just looking at it and thinking, I don't want to do this. But of course, I also had a huge weight of expectation because it wasn't just my careers teacher, it was all of my teachers. It were many of my friends, and the message they were telling me was that, Jamie, cycling is just a dream. And dreams rarely pay the bills, and dreams rarely take you places. And I started to feel this real anxiety. And what I started to think about was this choice of what am I going to do? But what I also started to realize was that actually maybe I didn't have a choice at all. And I'm not sure if you understand what I'm saying, but because of the environment that I'd grown up in on this housing commission estate, I knew almost no kids who had gone on to university. There were maybe 400 or 500 kids in the neighborhood where I grew up. There were only 1 or 2 of them that had gone to university. None of my brothers and sisters had had that chance. So I started to feel that actually, you know what, I don't have a choice at all. And a few weeks before my 18th birthday, I moved to Melbourne. And I started university, and I said goodbye to my European dream. And what did I do for the next 20 years? Well, for the next 20 years, I worked really hard. Because, one of the things I learned as a young, ambitious sportsman was that it was about discipline, it was about focus. So I worked really, really hard. And there was another reason I worked hard, because when I went to Melbourne University and I looked around, there was maybe 1 in 10 kids who were like me. Most of those kids were from private schools and privileged backgrounds. And do you know what? I hated those kids. Yeah, and I wanted to be better than them. Now, I didn't quite know what I wanted to be, though, because, I grew up in a neighborhood where everyone was a blue-collar worker. So I looked around at university, and I looked at the guys. Who's making money? And the guys I saw were these professors, actually. They didn't dress like the other professors. They wore suits and ties, and they drove fancy cars, and they made a lot of money. And those professors were the business school professors. So I said, I'm going to be one of them. So I worked really hard. So after my undergraduate scholarship, I went on and I got a graduate scholarship. And in fact, by the time I was 29 years old, it took me 10 years, I was working at one of the top graduate management schools in the world. I was living in London. And what did I do when I got to London? I worked really hard. And in fact, for 10 years, I got promoted, I got encouraged. And this is what happens. When you're a high performer, when you're an achiever, the doors open in front of you. So I kept working. And by the time I was 39 years old, I was there. I published in the world's top journals. I was working at one of the best business schools in the world. I was traveling the world. I was making more money than I ever imagined would be possible in my life. And I was also desperately unhappy. And in fact, that's who I was. And I'm not sure, what you see in this face, but what I saw in the mirror every single day was tiredness. Because I was really tired. I'd been working and working. This took a long time. This was 20 years as a journey. And I'd worked and I'd worked, and I'd put sleep aside, and I'd put hobbies aside, and I'd worked really hard to get there. So I was tired. And do you know what else I was? I was arrogant. Because to survive in that environment, that egotistical, hierarchical environment, I'd become a bit of an asshole. Because you have to be, right? You have to be sometimes in these environments. So that's what I'd become. So I was tired, I was arrogant, and I was unhealthy. Here's a guy who'd been a sportsman. It's not like I was really fat, but I was soft. I was all soft, and the other thing, though, was that I wasn't alone anymore. I'd been on this journey for 20 years, but actually along the way, I'd met a wonderful woman. We got married, and by this time, I had 3 children. And although I was this big success in my career, I wasn't a good husband, and I wasn't being a good father because I was so obsessed with this thing that I thought was success. And there's a wonderful quote by Lao Tzu, the Chinese philosopher. And Lao Tzu says, if you keep heading in the same direction, you're likely to get where you are going. And the fact was, I didn't like where I was going. But there was a problem, because I also had to realize that, for this 20 years that I've been this high achiever, this high performer, everyone's been telling me it's about you. It's about your success and about what you can do with your life. And you know what I started to understand? It wasn't about me at all. It was about us. Because it was about me and my wife and my kids and what we actually wanted from our life. So in 2009, I sat with my wife, Anami, and we took a sheet of paper and a bottle of wine. I think it was 2, actually. And we drew a picture. And what we did is we drew a picture about what success meant for us. And in fact, what was on that picture was love, actually. It was a relationship. Because with all this hard work and travel, we were missing romance as a couple. But also, I was not being a good dad. I remember reading bedtime stories to my kids, and I would skip bits because I had stuff to do. And do you know what? If you do that with an 8-year-old kid, they know. They've heard this story countless times. I didn't want to do that anymore. I wanted to read stories to my kids and go on holidays with them and play Monopoly. And the other thing, of course, that Annemie and I wanted was just a place. We'd been living in big cities and apartments and fancy places. We just wanted a little house with a garden somewhere near the forest or the lake where the kids could run and be free. That's how we grew up. Now, the career thing was a bit of a problem because, you know what? I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was this big professor, but I hated 80% of my job. I was this international consultant. I was this management guru. I didn't like it, but I wasn't sure at that moment what I wanted to do. My wife, Annemie, she wanted to get back to work. And of course, in the bottom right corner of that picture, what was there? There was a little hand-drawn bicycle. Because that fire that I had inside me when I was 9 years old, that fire, it was still burning. I still had this dream. And I discovered this thing called the World Masters Games. Have you heard of it? It's an Olympics for old people like me. It's every 4 years. It's an incredible organization, 23 different sports. In 2009, it was in Sydney. The next one was coming in Torino in 2013. And I said to my wife, I'm going to go. And guys, I don't know if you've ever had that look from your wife. And do you know what? I was terrified because what I realized was that picture did not fit with the job I had. So a few days later, I went into that prestigious school and I resigned my job. And that was a terrifying experience because I had to confront fear. Fear that it's all going to go away, the financial security. Fear that I'm going to lose this status, this professor title and all that stuff. But Annemie and I said, you know what? That doesn't matter. We will find our way. So what I did is I tried to find that new path. We tried to find a new path. And it was hard. For the first 2 years I was on that path, I was afraid. I earned almost nothing. When I got back on my bicycle and I started to train again, that took time. I fell down, I broke bones. But every single time Annemie and I experienced a setback or a heartache, we said, that's the picture. And we kept heading towards it. And on the 8th of August in 2013, I stood on the start line of the World Masters Games in Torino. And I can't tell you how this felt, because I dreamed about this moment since I was 9 years old. And I was not there alone, because in Torino were my 3 beautiful children and the most amazing wife. And as I stood on the start line, getting ready to be marshaled, onto the race, my little girl Hannah pushed her way through the marshals and she came up to me and she took my hand. And I will never, ever forget what she said, because she took my hand and she said, Papa, it's okay if you don't win. And you know what? She was completely right, because being there in Torino was not about winning a bike race. Being there in Torino was about the journey. And you know what? We'd had the courage. We had this belief that we could make something. And at that moment, when my little girl held my hand in Torino, I realized that every single thing that Annemie and I had drawn on that picture 4 years before was starting to fall into place. Okay, I was a different person. I was a writer. I was a speaker. I wasn't a professor anymore. But I was a husband. I think I'd become a good dad. And I was a cyclist again. And, the other thing that Hannah said was, watch out for those guys. And I love this picture because have a look at their faces. Those guys are there to win. Look at me. I'm smiling like a monkey, I'm all happy and everything. Because this was just amazing, And that race was 9 laps of an 8-kilometer circuit through Park Valentino, the streets of Turin. It was 9 laps of pain. And every single lap, I looked down and there were 3 little children, and they were screaming. There was a beautiful Belgian woman wrapped in an Australian flag, and she was cheering me on. And every single time we went around that circuit, we went up Mount Cappuccini. Mount Cappuccini was a 1-kilometer climb with an 18% gradient. And I'd been trained to put my body over that mountain every single day for 4 years. And every single time we went over the mountain, I looked behind me and there were 20 more guys gone. There were 20 more guys gone. And what you see here is 2 laps to go. And you see that guy at the back with the white and the green sleeves? That's me. And at that moment, a crazy thing started to go through my head. I could win! But I didn't win. That was an incredible Czech cyclist. I didn't get second because that was an Italian, but I did come home with a bronze medal. And this is my medal. And, I carry this with me everywhere. But you know what? And I guess this is the message I want to leave for you. It's fantastic. Success is great. And shooting for the moon is great. But out there in the universe, there are a lot of moons. So just make sure that the moon that you are shooting for is your own. Thank you very much.